Hi friends, this is Daniel Gregg speaking. I thought I'd make a little fun video here debunking a video, eschatological video that was put out recently. Um, the video is called Messiah 2030. Here, I'll give you a screenshot of it. And a pause. Okay. So as you can see, the thesis here is that the crucifixion was in 30 CE, which I would put AD 30 instead of 30 CE, but the crucifixion was really in AD 34. And then 2,000 years later, in 2030 CE, as you can see, there's a picture of what looks like Jesus coming on the cloud. So they're forecasting the second coming in 2030 CE. And this video has gained, let's see what they've gained here. Wow, 479,000 views, and only published 1 month ago. So we're going to debunk this video and some of its claims. Okay, so I'm going to go do this in sort of a podcast mode here. So like the video with Russians with an Attitude, if you've ever listened to that, where they have some random stuff going across the screen when they're not actually showing you anything important, but they're only talking. I'm just going to show you some random stuff also until I'm ready to actually show you something. Okay, so they picked the year 30 CE, as you can see. Yep. Which means common era as a crucifixion year. Okay, so the problem with this crucifixion year is that AD 30 is an essential part or foundation of what I would call the Catholic, mostly the Catholic and somewhat Protestant system of eschatology and biblical interpretation. And the reason that they devolve on this year is because the year exclusively provides a Friday date for crucifixion and also has a Sunday resurrection. You can't fit in this year, you can't fit a Wednesday crucifixion and a Sabbath resurrection. You can't fit a Thursday, or not really, you can't really fit a Thursday crucifixion and a Sunday resurrection. So it fails the biblical prediction in Matthew 12:40 of 3 days and 3 nights. So that's one problem with 30 CE or AD 30. Another problem with this year is that it depends on a revision of the regnal years of Tiberius Caesar in Luke 3:1 and so-called co-regency with Augustus, between Augustus and Tiberius, in order to bring the reign year of Tiberius in Luke 3:1 down far enough so that it would allow a 30 AD 30 crucifixion. The problem is the Roman historians know nothing of this co-regency, reckoning of reign years for Tiberius, and also it's squarely contradicted by the coins issued under the reign of Tiberius. By Antioch coins and other coins. So 30 AD does not work for that reason. In our Daniel 9 videos, we'll eventually come across why 30 AD doesn't work with that either. Okay, so the claim is made by the video that the second coming is in 2030, which is exactly 2,000 years after the crucifixion. So this is probably the only thing that they have partly right here. Now, they don't have the year 2030 right, nor do they have it right that it should be associated with the second coming, nor the year 30 CE. But the actual time period of 2,000 years between the year of the crucifixion and a very significant event is important. And this is based on Hosea chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, which you can look up. So there are 2 days, the 2 prophetic days, there's 2,000 years. But what I'd say is not that the second coming happens at the end of those prophetic days, but the restoration or resurrection of national Israel, the northern kingdom, comes about after those 2,000 years, which I'll get into when I discuss my eschatology. But we're going to just do this fun little video here for right now. Okay, so as you can see here, the claim is made that this is the biblical year 4030 CE, and that this is the biblical year 6000 and 2030 CE. Okay, so how do they justify this? Well, they take the passage where God says that there will be 120 years before the flood, and they say that they speculate that that's 120 jubilees. Okay, so actually the passage means that there will be 120 years until the world is destroyed by the flood. Okay, but they have overlooked this interpretation and they put their own interpretation on it, and they say that it means 120 jubilees. And the important point here is they assume that a jubilee period counts 1 to 50, and then it starts after the 50th year. It starts with the new 1 to 50. So that 120 jubilees is 6,000 years. Okay, when in actual fact, the jubilee period is 7 sabbatical periods of 49 years, and then the 50th year counts as the first year of the next cycle. And this is so that the Sabbath year is always on the same septenary cycle. It doesn't keep shifting forward. If you were to count 1 to 50 and then start the new cycle in the year after the 50th year, you would keep bumping the sabbatic cycle forward by 1 year, so that it wouldn't agree with itself after 7 sabbatical cycles. And the reason we know that this is incorrect is that Daniel 9 predicts 70 77s or 70 sabbatical cycles from the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem to the time that the Messiah is cut off. And if you allow this 1 to 50 and then start one after the one of the new cycle after the 50th year of the last cycle, then you will end up with too few sabbatical years in the time period between 445 BC and AD 34. In fact, it wouldn't work with any of the proposed years for the crucifixion to have the 7 sevens and the 62 sevens. You have to have a sabbatical cycle that counts 1 to 49, and the 50th year is the same year as the first year of the next cycle. Then it works. Okay, so this mistake of non-inclusive counting of the sabbatical cycles with the Jubilee is made by the rabbis and the rabbinical work Seder Olam. There are inconsistent views. On the one hand, they use the 1 to 49 and the 50th year counts as the first year. They use that when they're talking about Daniel 9. But then when they're talking about another part of the chronology, they assume that it's a 50-year cycle. So Seder Olam work actually contradicts itself on this score. It can't be that God commanded the sabbatical years and Jubilee to be counted two different ways. When he gave the commandment, he meant it for it to be counted just one way. Okay, so we know that when it talks about the 7-year cycle, it speaks of the 8th year and the 9th year, but that doesn't mean that the cycle is 8 or 9 years long before it starts counting again. The 8th year is actually the same as the first year of the next cycle. So speaking of the 50th year, it's just a way of speaking of the year after the 49th year. Okay, but the 49th, the cycle renews itself again after the 49th year. And this keeps the sabbatical cycle consistent. So for this reason, to compute 120 Jubilees out this way is actually contradictory to the Torah legislation for observing the sabbatical year. So you see biblical year 6,000 and biblical year 4,000. Now, another error related to this is that the timeline of world chronology is actually already beyond 6,000 years. Okay, and two principal errors were made to shorten the chronology, and one of those errors was that the period of the judges between the Exodus and the 4th year of Solomon has been shortened, probably by this group who did this video, probably to 480 years. Okay, when actually it was what would I say in my chronology? 613 years. Okay, and if you look at Josephus's longer chronology, you'll see that it's also longer. And what's happened is that the 480 years are the 480 years for the going up of the children of Israel out of the house of bondage, or out of Egypt. Okay, so whenever they were in servitude to the nations around them for 134 years, those years actually don't count in the. They're skipped over. Okay, so only the 480 years where they were not in servitude to other nations are being counted, and you can tell from the internal chronology that actually it is longer than 480 years. Another point where the chronology is artificially shortened is it's assumed that when Terah turned 70, that Abraham was born in the year that he was 70, instead of 60 years later, which would be when Terah was 130, and that shortens the chronology by 60 years. And you can tell from the structure of the Hebrew text and the death notice of Terah that actually this is a case like Noah and his 3 sons. We know that even though that Shem was listed first, he wasn't actually born when Noah was 500, because we're told later in a little chronological datum that Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the flood, and in the flood year Noah was 600 years old. So you see that Shem cannot have been born when Noah was 500. It just means that Noah lived 500 years and then he begot these sons. So we would assume normally that one of them would be born when he was that age, but not necessarily all of them. And we learn later that that their ages are different. Okay, so that's another reason why this 4,000, 6,000 year scheme does not work. Okay, and we see that it's based on incorrectly on a Jubilee. We see that they got Tiberius wrong. We see that they got the day of the crucifixion and the day of the resurrection wrong. And despite all the talk of this in this video about the Sabbath and the sevenfold thing here, they missed the important point of the resurrection on the first of the Sabbaths. Okay, so I will pause the video now and we'll see if I can find some more points to talk about. Okay, so I recall now that a key point of interpretation here that they make is that according to the Talmud, it says that mysterious or mischievous events began to happen in the temple 40 years before the destruction of the temple. So the destruction of the temple was in AD 70, so 40 years before that would be AD 30. And so things like the doors would open on their own accord, and if I remember right, the thread on Yom Kippur would not turn white, and there's probably some more details in the Talmud. So assuming that this Talmudical tradition is correct, it would point to AD 30. Okay, so the interpretation that this video puts on it is that this would correspond to the death of Yeshua, and that the strange events in the temple were commentary on the sacrificial system and divine commentary on the sacrificial system in the light of the sacrificial death of Messiah. Okay, so this interpretation is based on a wrong, incorrect view of atonement. It's probably based on the penal substitution theory and the theory of that to atone for sins means to cover them. Both ideas are incorrect. So I would like to suggest a correct interpretation that will still justify AD 30 as when these events happen, but it will put it in a different light. Okay, so what did happen in AD 30? Well, the crucifixion was in AD 34, and AD 30 was right at the beginning of Yeshua's ministry. In fact, it was the first Passover of his ministry in John chapter 2, when he presented himself in Jerusalem, and there the Jewish leaders rejected him as the Messiah. They weren't out to kill him yet, because it was the beginning of his ministry, but they rejected him at that point. So a reasonable explanation for the strange events in the temple is that these coincide with the rejection of Yeshua as Messiah by the religious authorities, and that the strange events in the temple are a sign of divine displeasure, not with the sacrificial system that was legislated in Scripture, but with the religious authorities that were operating the temple. There's actually none of the strange events in the temple are associated with what you would call mandatory or legislated elements of the Levitical system. The doors were the thread business is a traditional business, and the other things had to either do with tradition or things that really would not reflect badly on the sacrificial system. They just reflect badly on its divine displeasure on the religious leaders. So that gives an explanation for that Talmud passage that does not involve an incorrect theory of atonement and a put down of the sacrificial system. So of course this put down of the temple or the Levitical system is again part of the Roman Catholic and Protestant religious system of Christianity. So that's the foundations under this timeline rest on assumptions that are related to that. This is another reason why we should reject it. Okay, so we find here the video quoting from the Epistle of Barnabas to justify a 7,000-year prophetic timeline based on 6 days of creation and then the Sabbath. So the question is what's wrong with this? Okay, so first of all, they're quoting from the Epistle of Barnabas. So the Epistle of Barnabas is it's not scripture. It was not composed by the actual biblical Barnabas, but it's what you call a pseudepigrapha, okay, which means a false writing, claiming the name of someone else and then preaching false doctrine in it. And so the Epistle of Barnabas is on the whole anti-Levitical and anti-Sabbath, reinterpreting the Sabbath day and whatnot. So it's a questionable source to be quoting from, and you don't want to believe it. because it is a questionable source. The idea that the 6 days of creation forecast some kind of prophetical timeline in this viewpoint is given. They try to justify it by a passage in Isaiah where it says that God declares the beginning from the end, or from the beginning, the end. And the problem here is that even though the video seems to be Messianic or Hebraic, they're not really paying attention to the Hebrew text, which says in this Isaiah passage, the word is not the word for an absolute end, but it's actually the word meaning afterward, declaring from the beginning what comes afterward. And what it's saying is that the prophetic message was announced of what's going to come later or after than the present time. The prophetic message has been announced constantly from the beginning. So from Genesis 3, it doesn't mean that some kind of timeline was set up to the second coming starting right at the beginning. We really don't know that, and the scripture doesn't really say that. So to imply that would be false teaching. Another point I would like to make is that this 6,000 years and 7,000 year system that they've come up with is indeed mathematically appealing or symmetrically appealing, but it has two problems with it. One is that to assume that mathematical symmetry is required in everything God does this is a Greek idea, or it's related to the Greek idea of perfection, that if it doesn't have the mathematical symmetry that we expect, then it's not perfect. And the thing is that the author of this video is claiming that this is an appealing system, but has failed to compare it to other things that might be appealing. The cycle of the year being 365 days or 366 days is not a perfect 365 days all the time. And there was one calendar system that tried to make it 364 days to try to make it the year evenly divisible up into 52 weeks. Okay, because that's appealing. But the fact is that reality is different than that, and often the scripture explains things differently than that. Nowhere does it say in scripture that there's a 7,000 year timeline, or that their principle is there that a day can mean 1,000 years, but there's no actual passage that it says that a 1,000-year day principle needs to be applied in the way that they're applying it. The only point of agreement that I would say is the 2,000 years in Hosea 6:1 and 2. At least I hope that that's 2,000 years, okay? But these are prophetic interpretations, okay? So to say that there's any declaration of scripture of a 7,000-year timeline is wishful thinking. The video does make some interesting points about the fourth day and the seventh day, or 4 and 7. And there are indeed some number patterns in scripture, but it fails to notice the fact that the crucifixion was on the fourth day of the week and the resurrection was on the seventh day of the week. So while noticing some of these patterns, they've essentially they miss the main point. Okay, let's talk about this verse again that speaks of 120 years and see if we're compelled to make 120 Jubilees out of it. So I have here something I haven't published yet. Let me get my glasses here so I can see what I'm looking at. This is my Genesis interlinear right here. And we are zoomed in on Genesis 6:3. Vayomer Yahweh lo yadon ruchi ba'adam la'olam b'shegem hu basar v'hayu yamayo me'ah ve'esarim shana. Okay, so then Yahweh says, my spirit will not contend with the man to the obscurity of time, and that also he be flesh. Then his days had been 120 of the year. Okay, so the simplest meaning of this text is that from the time that the Most High made the statement about not contending with the man until the flood, it was 120 years. And we can see I've translated it, then his days had been 120 of the year. So the narrator here, presumably Noah, is making the observation that it was 120 years from that point. So there's nothing said about the Jubilee here, or that it means Jubilee. The simplest explanation of the year, or the years, and it's a generic use of the word year, which means a singular is used for, or what you would call what term was I using it for? That's where a singular form is used for more than one item, okay? And this is ubiquitous in Hebrew, so we're really speaking of years here. The simplest explanation is that we're talking about solar years, 120 cycles of the sun, or cycles of the days, returning to its starting point and from its starting point to its ending point, and not the Jubilee, and not a collection of Jubilee years. And as we have seen before, that with this Messiah 2030 video, their interpretation of the length of the Jubilee is actually incorrect according to Torah. Okay, now let's talk about this death of Moses prophecy here. I'm going to get washed out here. Okay, the presenter here, assumes that there is a death of Moses prophecy, but Scripture never speaks of a death of Moses prophecy. Our author has made this up whole cloth. So what does he call the death of Moses prophecy? Well, the author observes that Moses lived 120 years. He died in 120 years, and then he interprets this to mean 120 Jubilee years equals 6,000 biblical years. But this kind of use of scriptures is what I would call divination. It's like throwing bones from dead animals down, like called oracle bones, and then trying to read a message out of it that's only in the mind of the qualified priest or the qualified religious expert, quote unquote, who can interpret the meaning of what the bones say, because no sane human person would be able to get a message out of a configuration of bones. Likewise it is with just randomly picking numbers out of the text to support one's thesis. And of course, one could randomly pick a number out of the text to support some other thesis, in which case our author would simply tell us that we're not qualified to interpret it. But as with all things like this, including gematria and other number games, when it loses its connection to historical fact and historical reality, it's just wishful thinking. And this is what's going on here. It's misrepresenting God, it's bringing shame to religion, shame to scripture, and it's simply false. This is just another lie. Okay, and the next little tidbit that this video puts forth as support for its thesis is called the Jubilee prophecy. Now, I would say that there is some credence in the Jubilee prophecy, but I would interpret it differently than he does. Okay, so let's look at the Jubilee prophecy here. Okay, he finds a Jubilee prophecy in a passage that's quoted from Isaiah. It's quoted in Luke 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has set me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Okay, so the problem here is that there are multiple things being talked about: to proclaim the good news, to proclaim liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind. Okay, so this wasn't just proclaimed in 1 year. Yeshua actually carried these things out during his entire 4-year ministry. So this causes this passage to lose some of its specificity of talking about a particular year. But let's suppose that it does, in some sense, talk about a particular year here, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And the question is, which of the years that he did all of these things is he talking about? And I would agree that it does refer to a year of Jubilee, when liberty is proclaimed to the captives, and so on. We've seen this with the Jubilee of Nineveh, which you can find in my chronology book, and in other Jubilees. But there is a Jubilee coming at the end of the age, at the end of Daniel's 70th seven, okay? And it could be, and in fact I do believe it is this Jubilee he's talking about. He's announcing it now, or he's been proclaiming it continuously, so to speak. So if we want to narrow it down to a specific Jubilee, it's a Jubilee that's still in the future. And we have seen that his foundation for the definition of a Jubilee as exclusively counting 50-year units is incorrect when the first year of the next cycle comes after the 49th year, in order to keep the sabbatical system consistent with the same septenary cycle. Okay, let's take a listen here on the video to the next point, and then I'll comment on it.
Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. The Greek word aphesis is the word translated as forgiveness of sins in the ESV. Aphesis is the same word used for Jubilee in the Greek version of the Torah, the Septuagint. There is no Greek word for sins present in this text. It could literally read as follows. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no Jubilee. The Messiah's sacrifice affords us freedom from sin and death. Freedom from sin and death is the first prophetic fulfillment of the Jubilee prophecy. The Messiah died and resurrected in a Jubilee year to fulfill the first prophetic elements of the Jubilee prophecy.
Okay, so you heard that. He's claiming that Messiah died and resurrected in a Jubilee year. So the question then is what is wrong with putting the Jubilee as the crucifixion year? The problem is Daniel 9. So I've showed you this chart before here of Daniel 9, the 7 sevens and the 62 sevens. The death of Messiah comes after the 62 sevens. Then there's one more 7, and then the Jubilee. As you can see, the 2,000 years or 2 days of Hosea 6:2. All right. So the author is incorrect to make the Jubilee be the crucifixion year. The Jubilee comes after the 77s. How do we know this? Well, if we look at the prophecy of Daniel 9, we'll see that 77s are decreed for your holy people and your holy city to bring an end of iniquity, to make atonement for sin, to bring in everlasting righteousness, among other things. All of these things speak of a Jubilee at the end of the 77s, and not of the crucifixion. The crucifixion happens after the 67 sevens and the 62 sevens, and then there is one more 7. So the author is incorrect to make that year a Jubilee. He is correct that in Luke, and he agrees with me on this, that in Luke 4, he's speaking of a Jubilee that wasn't exactly the year that he was saying what he said in Luke 4 and in the synagogue. He was speaking of down the line. But he wasn't just speaking down the line of his crucifixion. He was speaking way, 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 way down the line, at a Jubilee at the end of this age. And then after the Messianic age, a Jubilee at the end of that. And the reason I say this is because should the Jubilee have already occurred at the end of the 77s, then everlasting righteousness would have had to come in.